Hello everybody. I apologise that it's taken so long to make this video, but I'm glad to say that I was finally able to. A while ago, when I was filming a review of my own 996 C4S, I asked people if they'd like to see a comparison of that car with my friend Dan's Nissan 350z. Well, many of you wanted to see that film, and although I sold my 996, my very helpful neighbour Dan has stepped in and provided me with his 996 C4S. So today I'm asking the question, is this Porsche really worth 4 or 5 times what the Nissan is? Now, I often get comments from people saying that I'm comparing cars that are totally different, and that's kind of the point of a comparison, isn't it? I mean, I don't really see the reason in getting two cars that are exactly the same together for a video. However, I will confess that in this instance, the deck is stacked considerably against the Nissan. If I was being truly fair and I had all cars at my disposal, and trust me, YouTubers don't always, I could make this fairer by, say, having a 370z instead, because for the price of this C4S, you could have a 370z Nismo or something like that. Or I could go the other way and get a cheaper, less desirable example of the 996, perhaps an early 3.4 C2. But for now, this is what we have. So before we get out and drive them, I'm going to just recap the differences between the two, because they aren't very different on paper. Now, the Nissan is powered by a 3.5 litre V6 producing about 300 horsepower, 260 pound-foot of torque, and that's pushing a car that weighs just about 1,500 kilos. The 911, by comparison, has a 3.6 litre flat 6 boxer engine, which is at the other end of the car, and that's producing just a little bit more power at 320, just a little bit more torque at 270, and it's pushing essentially the same weight of car. Both even have 6-speed manual gearboxes as well, and the power to weight ratios therefore are not dramatically different. Now, the big difference, of course, is in their construction. The 350z is based on essentially a saloon platform which they've modified and turned into a sports car, very much in the muscle car tradition of old, whereas the 911 is a pure sports car platform that admittedly was heavily shared with the Boxster of the time, so both cars do share a few parts with other models in their respective car makers' catalogues. Now, each one has some concessions to practicality. The Nissan has a reasonably large but very oddly sized boot at the back, whereas the Porsche has a more uniformly shaped but not especially large boot at the front. The 911's trump card, of course, is having 2 very small seats in the back, and if you're looking at transporting around young children or very small people, that may make a difference. It's the interiors of both cars which let them down. Now, the Nissan's is actually much nicer than you might expect, but the Porsche's is nowhere near as nice as you might expect, so they kind of meet in the middle. This one smells of classic JayEmm car, has actually plenty of leather in it, and this is a nice spec being the GT. It even has a Bose sound system and an attempt at sat-nav, and it's not a bad place to be, but there are sort of low-end touches. I don't like the light headlining and things like that, but overall, it's not too bad. If you're looking at buying your first proper sports car, you could certainly do a lot worse. Now, as big a fan of the 996 as I am, and believe me, this is probably my favourite model of 911, I am beyond trying to defend its interior. Now, this one is pretty much bone standard with the regular seats, my car having had the sports seats, and it's a mixture of kind of cheap, nasty plastic, and then there's the odd bit of nice leather, and it's all a little bit low rent in here. I think if you were buying your first premium car or your first Porsche, you would be a little bit disappointed by it. The truth is, though, that for both of these cars, what really should sway your decision and what ultimately should set this apart from that is how they drive. So let's find out, and to set our baseline, we're going to take the Nissan out first. Now, I've been driving my neighbour's 911 around for a little bit, so I've taken some time to acclimatise myself to that car. Jumping back in Dan's 350z, the first time that I've driven it in a few months, a couple of things are apparent. First off, the gear shift is actually really nice, although it is extremely springy. It wants to bounce back to the neutral position with some serious force, so you do have to be aware of that. The 911's box needs a little bit more help from the driver, it would seem. This car is certainly not slow. The steering in the 350Z is certainly not bad, but it's also not as precise as the 911. Does have a real nice weight to it though, and the view out the front is actually pretty pleasing. It's what you'd expect from a traditional GT car. You've got plenty of bonnet and you do feel a little bit enclosed. In fact, with some lower, sportier seats, this would almost have the same kind of seating position that you'd expect from one of the Aston Martins that I've previously driven. Granted, it wouldn't have the same feeling of luxury as those cars, but it'd still be not a bad place to be, and it feels very different from your sort of garden variety hatchback or saloon car. The exhaust note on this car is also perfectly judged, having a custom system made by the people at Thorny Motorsport, and if you're interested in how a custom exhaust is made, we actually did a video on that very topic, and I'll put the link to that up here. Suffice it to say, this is a just right kind of system. It's not very shouty, but it's also got a fruitier note than standard. Rev-matching in this car is very easy, although it has this tendency to kind of bounce the revs when you're trying to shift up a little bit, a slightly odd thing that the car does, and we're not really sure why or how to get rid of it. There's plenty of gauges in here too, so it feels like you are driving a real sports car. The 7,000 RPM rev limit is also a nice thing to have, and if you want something a little bit higher, they did do an HR version of this engine. They just stand it for high rev, which would let you go to about 7,500. And let's be honest, we can't talk about the 996 generation of 911 without discussing its fragility in the engine department. I'd love to say it's entirely unfounded rumours, and no doubt somebody will comment and tell me that actually it's only certain engines are affected, and it's definitely true that some are more prone to catastrophic failure than others, but the truth is that if you have a 996, that is something that you need to be prepared for. By contrast, this VQ unit is actually very robust, and as you might expect, although the Nissan is certainly not a maintenance-free car, particularly not at the age these cars are and the use that they may have had in the past, fixing them is certainly going to be cheaper than it is with the 911. The only problem that Dan has really experienced so far was a failing sensor in the clutch pedal, and what that meant was that the car would on occasion refuse to start because it didn't think you had the clutch pushed down. And fortunately he sorted that himself. It took a little bit of elbow grease and some swearing, but it was done, and since then the car's been actually very good to him. Now, while any car with 300 horsepower and rear-wheel drive definitely has the ability to get the novice driver into trouble, I would wager that you could also do the same thing with a 150 horsepower front-wheel drive hatchback, so I'm really not going to count that against this car. The truth is that unless you're in pretty extreme conditions, the 911's all-wheel drive doesn't present any kind of advantage at all. In fact, all it really does is add weight and complexity to the car. And with examples of these priced effectively at the same level as a pretty ropey 986 Boxster, the 911's certainly going to have to be something special to really justify that extra asking price. After all, if the badge is all that I'm after, I can pick those up on eBay for about 15 quid. It is actually remarkable how truly different it actually does feel. Most of the controls in here seem to have a real weight to them, with the exception of the steering, which is light, but in that classic 911 way, full of feel. The car, certainly after driving the 350Z, truly does feel rear engine and exactly as people would describe a 911. The 996 is often criticised for, being a little bit soulless in comparison to some of the air-cooled cars that came before. But I am an absolute steadfast believer that this truly does deserve to be considered as a proper 911, and it certainly handles that way. In fact, if your only experience of 911s is of the more recent 991 and now 992 variety, I really urge you to give one of these a go, because they would be alien in comparison to the newer cars. They truly are, and they're just wonderful for it. Now, the gearbox in this car is much better than in my own, and it's actually quite nice to use, whereas mine wasn't the best. The throw, however, is still a bit too long, certainly in comparison to the Nissans, and I would personally put a short shifter kit on any 996. Heel and towing is just as easy as in the Nissan, except the upshifts are a little bit nicer in this because it doesn't have that weird little rev jump that the Nissan does. The interior in here, although it is pretty crappy, soon kind of fades away because your view is dominated by the road and those classic little humps where the headlights hide. The dials, although they are like the Nissans now a little bit dated, are clear and present to you all the information that you would need. The speedo is frustratingly small, even the digital reader is tiny in comparison to most modern units, but it's easier to read than the analog item, which jumps up in 25 mile an hour increments. If you've ever sat in a 986 or 996, you'll know what I'm talking about. They are odd at the best of times. Oh, that front end is just beautiful though. Now, I have been driving alongside this for the last couple of days one of the greatest driver's cars of all time, and you'll see that video on the channel next, but this thing is an utter joy to pilot. I know there are people out there that'll tell you that the four-wheel drive system corrupts the steering and ruins the purity of the 911 experience, but that's just not the case. In fact, once upon a time when my mother had a 996 C4, we loaned it to a magazine and it was completely debadged at the time, and they didn't realise that it was a C4, so that should really tell you everything that you need to know. Of course, the real benefit of the C4S in this generation of car is that wider turbo body shell, which gives it just so much presence, and this does feel like a rather special car. The 350z is certainly a nice car, and having driven it for the first time in a few months, it's a wonder to pilot, but this does just feel next level. It does feel a little bit punchier in the mid-range than the Nissan, not massively so, but there is a noticeable difference. It's also a joy to rev out, redlining just like the 350 at 7,000. Now, this doesn't sound quite as good as my car because it is running a totally stock exhaust, but there are plenty of choices out there if you want your 996 to sound a little bit fruitier. In truth, though, the engine is very good for sure, but it is the steering that dominates things in the 911, and that front end just bobbing and weaving. And this car's only got about a quarter of a tank of fuel in it at the moment, and believe me, that does actually make a difference to the way that these cars handle. Now, the seats aren't perfect. I prefer much sportier ones. I put some aftermarket buckets in here, and the interior is atrocious and unforgivable. And the simple fact of the matter is that I cannot, on paper, justify the 911's extra price. Is the 911 the better car? Yes, for sure it is. It certainly feels like the more special experience. Just every time you touch that wheel, it's just talking to you in a way that is simply foreign to the 350z. And there's absolutely no shame in that at all. There's a big price difference between these cars now, and there always has been. This cost basically twice as much as the Nissan ever did, so it really should be better. And if you're into the sports car experience, this, I think, is twice the car. However, if you're down the pub arguing with your mates and one of them says, well, a 911 can't be worth, 4 times as much as the 350z, no, it isn't 4 times better. And for that reason, the Nissan is actually the moral victor here. The 911's the better car, but that always should have been the case. I still love it, and I'd love to own another one day. But if I had a 350z, I certainly wouldn't feel like I was being shortchanged at all. And if a 350z is what you've got, it's a damn good motor car. So there you go. A short little video, but hopefully one that you've enjoyed. I'll see you guys for the next one. We've got something very special indeed. Bye-bye.